It was late, and the quiet hum of the fridge was the only sound breaking the stillness in the kitchen. I had just finished stacking up the dishes, wiping down the counters, making sure everything was in order. There was a comfort in the routine, the predictability of it all. But that night, nothing felt predictable. Just as I reached to turn off the light, I sensed something. A subtle shift in the air behind me, as if someone was there. My heart skipped a beat, and I turned sharply, expecting nothing but empty space. Instead, I froze. There was a man standing in the doorway. A stranger. His face was unreadable, but his eyes bore into me with an intensity that sent a chill through my body. I didn't know him, had never seen him before, and yet, there he was, silent, unmoving, and undeniably real. "Didn't mean to scare you," he said, and his voice was smooth, carrying an unexpected warmth that made me hesitate. He had a casual look about him, but there was something compellingly out of place about his being there. I couldn't shake the feeling that he knew something I didn't. "Oh, no worries," I replied, trying to keep my tone light, though I could feel my pulse racing. "Didn't hear you come in. I thought I was alone." He smirked, as if he could sense my discomfort, but said nothing in response. He just stood there watching, like he was waiting for something. Or testing me, maybe. I fumbled for something to say, a way to breach the silence that was quickly thickening between us. "You, want something to eat?" I offered, awkwardly gesturing toward the half-clean counter. It was an odd thing to say, but somehow the words came out before I could think them through. He shrugged, a small smile playing at the corner of his mouth. "Sure, why not?" I turned back to the fridge, pulling out a few things, all while I could feel his eyes lingering on me. It was that look again, that strange familiarity mixed with something else I couldn't quite name. But I didn't let it deter me. I busied myself, hoping the simple act of cooking would bring me back to the normal rhythm I'd lost the moment he appeared. As I began chopping, I couldn't help but ask, "So, what brings you here?" He paused for a moment, as if debating whether to answer, then said, "Got a little lost on the way, I suppose." There was a lightness to his words, but something about his tone made me think there was more to it than that. Our conversation flowed naturally from there, but there was an undercurrent of mystery that remained unspoken. The way he looked at me, the subtle pauses between his words, it was as if he was waiting for me to catch on to something I couldn't quite grasp. And that made me nervous in a way I hadn't expected. The kitchen, once a place of simple routine, felt charged now, each movement heightened. As we talked, I noticed small things. The way he leaned just a little too close, the warmth of his arm brushing against mine as he reached for a spoon, the almost tangible tension building between us. I couldn't help but feel there was something magnetic, something undeniable, that was pulling us closer even though we both kept it casual. But as our laughter filled the room, I started to feel the edges of something unfamiliar creeping into the air. It was in the way his gaze lingered a little longer, the soft undertone in his voice when he spoke, as though we were both aware of the current passing between us, but were too cautious to name it. It was thrilling, nerve-wracking, like standing at the edge of a cliff and wondering if you'd dare to step forward. At some point, he took the knife from my hands, his fingers grazing mine. "Here, let me do that," he murmured, his voice low. It was such a simple gesture, but there was an intimacy in it that took me by surprise. I hadn't realized how close we'd gotten until then, the two of us standing there, side by side, in the dim light of the kitchen. He began chopping, and I watched him, unable to resist the quiet intensity he brought to something as ordinary as slicing vegetables. To resist the quiet intensity he brought to something as ordinary as slicing vegetables. The rhythm of his movements, the quiet confidence he exuded, it was mesmerizing, and I felt myself getting drawn in, forgetting the strangeness of his sudden presence. Somehow, in that small act, he'd managed to shift the balance, taking control in a way that left me both intrigued and a little unsteady. We fell into a companionable silence, punctuated only by the soft chop of the knife against the cutting board. I leaned against the counter, watching him, feeling a strange pull that was both exciting and unnerving, and yet, I didn't want to break the spell, didn't want to disrupt whatever fragile connection had formed between us. But then, just as I thought I'd gotten a handle on it, he glanced up, catching my gaze in a way that made my heart skip. He held it there, his expression unreadable, before finally breaking into a small smile that sent a shiver down my spine. "There's something about this place," he murmured, almost to himself. "Feels familiar." His words hung in the air, thick with an emotion I couldn't quite name. There was something about the way he said it that made me feel as though I were part of some secret, something only the two of us shared. I wanted to ask him what he meant, to dig a little deeper, but the intensity of his gaze held me captive, and in that moment, it felt as though the kitchen walls had closed in, leaving just the two of us, standing on the edge of something I didn't fully understand. But whatever it was, I couldn't deny that I wanted to find out. The days after that night in the kitchen blurred into a pattern I couldn't quite explain. It wasn't like we'd made plans to see each other again, and yet somehow, he seemed to show up whenever I least expected it, like he knew just when to appear, as if he could read my thoughts before I had them. It wasn't something I was used to, and as much as I tried to brush it off, I couldn't ignore the strange anticipation building within me. I would catch myself waiting for the sound of his voice, the familiar scrape of the kitchen chair as he settled in, his eyes meeting mine across the room with his voice, the familiar scrape of the kitchen chair as he settled in, his eyes meeting mine across the room with that quiet, knowing look that always left me on edge. It was unsettling in a way that both thrilled and frightened me, and no matter how hard I tried to act unaffected, I knew I was caught. We both were, though neither of us dared to say it out loud. Was caught. We both were, though neither of us dared to say it out loud. The tension between us grew heavier, a presence I felt even when he wasn't around. It clung to me, a feeling I carried like a secret I didn't know how to share. And maybe that was part of the allure, the secrecy, the thrill of something unspoken lingering in the air. It was there in the way he looked at me, in the subtle, almost accidental touches that left me feeling breathless and a little unsteady. One evening, he appeared again, just as I was about to close up. The sight of him leaning casually in the doorway, his face lit only by the dim kitchen light, made my heart stutter in my chest. He had a way of making even the smallest gestures feel charged, as though there were layers to everything he did, secrets I wasn't meant to unravel. Yet I found myself wanting to. Desperately, without a word, he stepped into the kitchen, moving closer, his expression unreadable. I could feel the air shift between us, thickening with a tension that was almost palpable. It was as if we were locked in some invisible dance, each move carefully calculated, neither of us willing to break the fragile balance that had somehow formed. I glanced up, meeting his gaze, and felt a strange flutter in my stomach. His eyes held mine, a quiet intensity simmering beneath the surface, and for a moment, everything else faded away. It was just the two of us, standing there in the small kitchen, the silence heavy with words left unsaid. Standing there in the small kitchen, the silence heavy with words left unsaid. "So, you just keep showing up here," I said, forcing a smile in an attempt to lighten the mood, though my heart was pounding in my chest. He didn't answer right away, just tilted his head slightly, his eyes never leaving mine. "Maybe I have a reason," he replied, his voice low, carrying a weight that made my pulse quicken. There was something in the way he spoke, a certainty that left no room for doubt, and I felt myself leaning in, drawn to him in a way that defied logic. I swallowed, searching for something to say, but the words seemed to catch in my throat. I didn't want to admit the effect he had on me, didn't want to acknowledge the way my body responded to his every move. But I knew he could sense it, He could see it in the way I held his gaze a little too long, the way my breath caught whenever he was near. And as much as I wanted to deny it, I knew I was falling, caught in a current I didn't know how to escape. But before I could speak, he took a step closer, closing the distance between us. His hand brushed against mine, a brief fleeting touch, but it sent a shiver down my spine, igniting a fire that had been smoldering just beneath the surface. I felt myself lean into him, drawn by a force I couldn't explain, a need that was both exhilarating and terrifying. "Why do you keep coming back?" I whispered, my voice barely audible, as if speaking too loudly would shatter the fragile connection between us. He looked at me, his eyes searching mine, and for a moment, I thought he might pull away. But instead, he leaned in, his breath warm against my skin. "Maybe I'm waiting for you to let me in," he murmured, his words laced with a promise that left me breathless. The weight of his gaze, the quiet intensity of his voice, it was all too much, and yet, not enough. I wanted more, needed more, even if it meant stepping into the unknown. The air between us grew thick with unspoken desire, a tension that had been building for days, weeks, and now, finally, it felt as though it might break. But just as I was about to close the distance, to let myself fall, a sudden noise broke through the silence, shattering the moment like glass. We both froze, our eyes meeting in a shared look of surprise, and the spell was broken. He took a step back, the tension between us shifting, replaced by a sudden, inexplicable tension that left me feeling exposed. I could see it in his eyes, the way his gaze darkened, his jaw tightening as he struggled to regain his composure. And just like that, the warmth between us cooled, replaced by a chill that sent a shiver down my spine. I didn't understand it, didn't know why he suddenly seemed so distant, as if he were pulling away even as he stood right in front of me. What's wrong?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper, but he didn't answer. Voice barely a whisper, but he didn't answer. He just looked at me, his expression unreadable, and for a moment I felt a flicker of fear, a sense that something was slipping away, something I couldn't hold on to. He turned, his gaze shifting to the doorway as though he were seeing something I couldn't, a shadow only he could understand. That the room felt colder. The once warm atmosphere now tinged with something darker, a tension that had nothing to do with the desire simmering between us. It was as if he were caught in a battle I couldn't see, a war waging within him that had somehow spilled over into our quiet little world. I reached out, wanting to bridge the gap between us, to pull him back from whatever edge he was standing on. But he stepped away, his jaw clenched as though he were holding something back. "I'm sorry," he murmured, his voice barely audible, as though he were speaking more to himself than to me. And in that moment, I realized that there was more to him than I had ever known, layers I hadn't even begun to understand. He turned to leave, his movements tense, as though he were being pulled by some invisible force, and I felt a pang of loss, an ache that settled deep within me. But just as he reached the doorway, he paused, his hand lingering on the frame, and for a brief moment, I thought he might turn back, that he might stay, that he might finally let me in. But he didn't. Without a word, he slipped into the shadows, leaving me alone in the empty kitchen, the silence pressing down on me like a weight I couldn't shake. And as I stood there, the echoes of our time together lingering in the air, I realized that whatever was happening between us was far from over. The story hadn't ended. It was just beginning, and I knew, deep down, that I was in too deep to turn back. I was caught, tangled in a web of emotions I didn't understand, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that he would be back, that he would always be there, waiting, just beyond the edge of my reach. And as I leaned against the counter, staring into the empty space where he'd stood, I made a silent promise to myself. Whatever it took, I would find a way to understand him, to uncover the mystery that lay hidden within those dark, unreadable eyes. But I knew it wouldn't be easy. It had been days since that charged evening in the kitchen, and yet I couldn't shake the memory of him, the intensity of his gaze, the mystery that lingered in the air between us. Every time I walked into the kitchen, I half expected to see him there, leaning against the counter, watching me with that quiet intensity that had become both a comfort and a thrill. And then, one night, he was there. I hadn't heard him come in, hadn't even sensed his presence until I turned around, and there he was, standing just a few feet away, his expression as unreadable as ever. My heart skipped, the air in the room thickening as our eyes met, and for a moment, it felt as though time had stilled, as though the world outside didn't exist. "Thought you weren't coming back," I whisper. "Ed," the words barely a breath, but he heard them. His gaze softened, a glimmer of something unspoken flickering in his eyes as he took a step closer. I could feel the warmth radiating from him, the quiet energy that had always drawn me in, and as he closed the distance between us, I felt myself giving into the pull, the inevitability of it all. His hand reached out, brushing a strand of hair from my face, and the gentleness of the gesture caught me off guard. There was something different about him tonight, a vulnerability in his touch that I hadn't seen before. It was as though he were letting down his guard, letting me see past the walls he'd built around himself. I looked up, my breath catching as his gaze met mine, and for a moment, we stood there in silence, caught in a moment that felt both fragile and powerful. I could feel the warmth of his hand lingering against my cheek, the subtle brush of his fingers against my skin, and I knew, in that moment, that whatever was happening between us was real. Without a word, he leaned in, his lips brushing mine in a kiss that was soft, almost hesitant, as though he were testing the waters, waiting to see if I would pull away. But I didn't. I leaned into him, my arms wrapping around his shoulders, feeling the tension melt away as we fell into each other. The world around us faded, and all I could feel was him, the warmth of his body pressed against mine, the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath my hands. There was something tender, almost reverent in the way he held me, as though I were something precious, something to be cherished. It was a feeling I hadn't expected, and yet, it felt so natural, so right. His hands found mine, intertwining our fingers as he pulled me closer, deepening the kiss, and in that moment, I felt a connection that went beyond words, beyond logic. It was as though we had found something in each other, something neither of us had known we were searching for. We moved together, our bodies swaying in a rhythm that felt both familiar and new, as though we were two parts of a whole, finally coming together. There was a quiet intensity in his touch, a warmth that seeped into my skin, filling me with a sense of peace I hadn't known I needed. His hands brushed along my arms, gentle yet firm, grounding me in the moment as we sank deeper into each other. I could feel the tension in his shoulders, the quiet strength in his movements, and as I looked up, I saw the vulnerability in his eyes, a softness that took my breath away. We didn't speak, didn't need to. Everything we felt, everything we wanted to say, was there in the silence, in the gentle brush of our lips, the warmth of his hands holding mine. It was a connection that went beyond words, a bond that felt as though it had been there all along, waiting for us to find it. I could feel the warmth radiating from him, the quiet hum of his breath against my skin as we held each other, lost in the moment. There was something sacred in the silence, a tenderness that filled the air, and as we stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, I knew that I had found something rare, something I didn't want to let go. We stayed like that, swaying gently in the dim light of the kitchen, our breaths mingling in the quiet, the world outside fading into a distant memory. It was just us, caught in a moment that felt both infinite and fleeting, and as the minutes slipped by, I felt a sense of peace settle over me, a quiet joy that I hadn't felt in a long time. He brushed his lips along my cheek, a soft, feather-like touch that sent a shiver down my spine, and as he pulled me closer, I felt a warmth spread through me, filling me with a sense of belonging I hadn't known I was missing. It was a feeling I couldn't explain, a quiet certainty that I was exactly where I was meant to be, where I was meant to be. We shared gentle kisses, each one lingering a little longer, each one carrying a promise that went beyond words. It was as though we were speaking a language only we could understand, a silent conversation that filled the air with a warmth that wrapped around us, binding us together in a way that felt both fragile and unbreakable. Us, binding us together in a way that felt both fragile and unbreakable. The room around us was quiet, the only sound the soft hum of the fridge, the gentle rhythm of our breaths mingling in the silence. And as we held each other, lost in the moment, I felt a sense of peace settle over me, a quiet joy that filled the empty spaces in my heart, a quiet joy that filled the empty spaces in my heart. There was no need for words, no need to fill the silence with explanations or promises. Everything we felt, everything we wanted to say, was there in the gentle touch of his hand, the warmth of his embrace. It was a connection that went beyond logic, a bond that felt as though it had been waiting for us to find it all along. We stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, the world outside fading into a distant memory, and for the first time in a long time, I felt whole. It was a feeling I hadn't expected, a quiet certainty that I had found something real, something I didn't want to let go. As the night slipped by, we stayed there, our breaths mingling in the quiet, our hearts beating in unison, and as I looked up, I saw the same feeling reflected in his eyes, a warmth that filled me with a sense of peace, a quiet joy that I knew I would carry with me long after the night was over. And in that moment, I knew that whatever happened next, whatever challenges lay ahead, we would face them together. It was a promise, a silent vow that needed no words, and as we held each other, wrapped in the warmth of the kitchen, I felt a sense of hope bloom within me, a quiet faith that we had found something worth holding on to. The world outside was quiet, the night stretching out before us like a promise, and as we stayed there, lost in each other, I knew that I had found something rare, something I would cherish for the rest of my life. It was a feeling that went beyond words, a connection that filled the empty spaces in my heart, and as I held him close, I felt a quiet joy settle over me, a peace that I hadn't known I was missing. We stayed like that, wrapped in each other's arms, our hearts beating in unison, and as the minutes slipped by, I knew that whatever lay ahead, we would face it together. It was a bond that went beyond words, a connection that filled the air with a warmth that wrapped around us, binding us together in a way that felt both fragile and unbreakable. And as the first light of dawn crept into the kitchen, casting a soft glow over us, I knew that I had found something worth holding on to, a love that went beyond logic, beyond explanation. It was a quiet certainty, a feeling that filled me with a sense of peace, a joy that I knew would stay with me long after the night had ended. After that night, it felt as though the world had shifted in subtle ways, like everything was familiar but somehow changed. I found myself moving through my days with a sense of calm I hadn't known before, a quiet contentment that lingered long after he'd left, a quiet contentment that lingered long after he'd left. And yet, beneath it all, there was a restlessness too. A feeling that I was waiting for something, though I couldn't name what. He didn't come by every day. His appearances were irregular, often at the moments when I'd least expect it. Yet each time, he brought with him that same energy, that same unspoken intensity that filled the room as soon as he entered. It was as though he were woven into the fabric of my life now, appearing like a shadow, a presence that felt both familiar and mysterious. One evening I was alone in the kitchen, reflecting on the events that had unfolded between us, the quiet intimacy we'd shared, the way he'd look at me like I was the only person in the world, and just as I was about to lose myself in thought, I felt it, a familiar shift in the air, the almost imperceptible feeling that he was near. I turned, and there he was, standing at the doorway, his expression softer than I'd ever seen it. There was something different about him tonight, a gentleness in his eyes, as though he were letting me see a part of him he usually kept hidden. Without a word, he walked over, closing the distance between us in a way that felt both inevitable and extraordinary. His hand reached out, brushing along my arm, and I felt a warmth spread through me, filling me with a quiet joy that left me breathless. "You're here," I murmured, the words slipping out before I could stop them. He smiled, a soft, almost wistful look crossing his face. "Always," he replied, his voice low, as though he were confessing something only the two of us would understand. And in that moment, it felt as though the world outside didn't exist, as though we were the only two people in the universe, bound together by something invisible, something unbreakable. We moved through the kitchen together, a silent rhythm that had become second nature, and as we shared small moments, I realized just how much he'd become a part of my life. It was the little things, the way he'd catch my hand as we passed by each other, the quiet smiles we'd share, the unspoken understanding that lingered between us. It was a bond that went beyond words, a connection that filled the air with a warmth I hadn't known was possible. But tonight, there was something different, something heavier, as though he were holding back, as though there was something he wanted to say but couldn't. I felt it in the way he moved, the way his gaze lingered on me a little longer, a quiet tension that simmered just beneath the surface. I reached out, my fingers grazing his arm, and he looked at me, his eyes filled with a depth I couldn't quite understand. There was a vulnerability there, a softness that took my breath away, and for a moment, it felt as though we were on the edge of something we couldn't take back. "Is everything okay?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, but he didn't answer right away. Instead, he took my hand, guiding me to the small table by the window, where the soft glow of the streetlights cast a warm light over us. He looked at me, his expression thoughtful, as though he were trying to find the right words, and I felt my heart skip, a quiet tension building in the silence between us. It was as though he were about to share a part of himself, a piece of his past that had been hidden in the shadows. "There's something you should know," he began, his voice low, almost hesitant. And in that moment, I felt the weight of his words, the quiet gravity that filled the air. I waited, my heart pounding in my chest, as he took a deep breath, his gaze meeting mine with an intensity that left me breathless, and as he began to speak, I could see the memories flickering in his eyes, a glimpse of a life I hadn't known, a world he'd kept hidden, even from himself. He spoke in quiet tones, his voice steady but filled with an emotion I hadn't heard before. He shared fragments of his past, pieces of a story that had shaped him in ways I hadn't imagined. It was a story of resilience, of struggles and triumphs, of losses that had left scars deeper than I could see. And as he spoke, I felt a connection grow between us, a bond that went beyond the quiet moments we'd shared, beyond the laughter and warmth that had filled our days. It was a bond forged in vulnerability, in the quiet strength that came from letting down one's walls, from trusting someone enough to share the parts of oneself that were raw and real. When he finished, there was a silence that settled over us, a silence filled with a depth that went beyond words. I reached out, my hand resting over his, and he looked at me, his gaze filled with a quiet gratitude that left me feeling both grounded and weightless. We sat like that, the two of us wrapped in a moment that felt both fragile and eternal, and as the minutes slipped by, I felt a sense of peace settle over me, a quiet certainty that I was exactly where I was meant to be. Eventually, he looked up, his gaze meeting mine, and there was a softness in his expression, a warmth that filled the room, casting a glow over everything around us. He squeezed my hand, a silent promise that needed no words, and in that moment, I knew that whatever lay ahead, we would face it together. There was no need for grand gestures, no need for declarations or promises. Everything we felt, everything we wanted to say, was there in the silence, in the warmth that wrapped around us, binding us together in a way that went beyond logic, beyond explanation. As the night wore on, we stayed there, wrapped in each other's presence, our breaths mingling in the quiet, our hearts beating in unison, and as the first light of dawn crept into the room, casting a soft glow over us, I felt a sense of hope bloom within me, a quiet joy that I knew would stay with me long after the moment had passed. Eventually he stood, pulling me to my feet, his hand lingering in mine as we shared a quiet smile, a look that held more than words could ever express. It was a moment of quiet smile, a look that held more than words could ever express. It was a moment of quiet understanding, a connection that went beyond words, a bond that filled the air with a warmth that I knew would carry us through whatever lay ahead. And as we stood there, the morning light casting a gentle glow over us, I felt a quiet certainty settle over me, a feeling that went beyond logic, beyond explanation. It was a bond that had been forged in silence, in the quiet moments we'd shared, and as we held each other, I knew that I had found something rare, something I would cherish for the rest of my life. We left the kitchen, stepping into the new day, our hands still intertwined, and as we walked, I felt a quiet joy settle over me, a peace that I hadn't known I was missing. It was a feeling that went beyond words, a connection that filled the empty spaces in my heart, and as I looked over at him, I knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, we would face them together. It was a story that hadn't ended, a story that would carry us forward one day at a time, and as we walked into the light, I knew that this was only the beginning of something beautiful, a journey that would bind us together in ways we had yet to discover, but that's a story for another time. For now, we had each other. And that was enough.